Hey everybody, how are you doing? It's time for section 3 of chapter 4. Buddhism. We've been talking about Indian subcontinent, we've been talking about Hinduism, we've been talking about ancient religions of the world, and Buddhism and Hinduism, there's some similarities, and we're going to cover a few of those, but there are also some differences that you will need to want, yeah, that makes sense, you will want to be aware of for the chapter test in a few short days. You may wonder, I got this little growth going on here. It's not actually a growth. It is a little Buddha. I don't know if you have ever seen carvings similar to this. Now there are many different depictions of the Buddha, or the revered or the respected person or image of Buddhism, and the Buddha here is quite happy, and he's happy because he knows that I'm going to be talking about his religion at this time. So I'm going to put Mr. Buddha down and kind of have him pointing at me, and we're going to dive right in. So we are section 3 of chapter 4, the beginnings of Buddhism, and if you turn in your textbooks, right there, if you turn in your textbooks to page 119, then you will see the beginnings of Buddhism. And basically, it starts off with a story, and it's a story that we covered in class, and it's a story about a young prince named Siddhartha Gautama, which is fun to say. And this young prince lived pretty much an exclusive life in and around the royal court. He never really ventured outside. And one day, he decided that he was going to experience the world beyond just the courtyard. And the truth is that the tradition says that basically what he did is he ventured outside of the court and the royal family area and realized that life was not as wonderful as he had experienced on a personal level. As a matter of fact, he got out into the world, he went into the towns, he went into the farm areas, and he realized that there was a massive amount of suffering. There were people who were obviously mourning deaths of loved ones and family, and there were people who were very sick and very ill, and that's not something he had experienced in his entire life. So around the age of 30, he decided that what he was going to do was try and find out why there was so much suffering and misery in this life and in his lifetime. He gave up his riches, basically walked away, according to the tradition, walked away from his family's heirs and his family money, and lived a life of wandering, attempting to find the true cause of suffering in the world to hopefully eradicate. It's a big SAT word. That means get rid of completely, or at least identify what the cause of suffering was so that it could be addressed and he could get rid of it. If you look on page 119, it gives you just a little bit of that story. Okay, bud. That was Josh. He'll be back. That was a little bit of that story on page 119, and as I said, he gave up his wealth, his family, and basically his life to try and find the answer of severe suffering. That search and what he discovered in that search became the foundations of the teachings of Buddhism after about 6 or 7 years of wandering. And on page 120, it says that as he traveled about the countryside, you can see at the very top of 120, it says he started actually studying with Hindu philosophers. So the two religions kind of blended a little bit early on. But their ideas didn't really satisfy what he was looking for, so he decided that since it seemed like the Hindu priests could only pass on information and knowledge, that wasn't sitting well with Siddhartha Gautama, so he decided that what he was going to do is try to find these answers on his own. So he went and looked outwardly for the cause of suffering. On page 120, you'll see the search for understanding. You come to a vocabulary word. Now, we talked about vocabulary many times. I'd like to remind you that some of you still need to work on the vocabulary a little bit. You're struggling with not just finding the vocab word, but what you're struggling with is finding the entire word, not just the root definition. Okay, remember, sometimes there's pieces and parts that make up the whole definition. All right, and that's something that you guys have to be aware of. On page 119, it talks about meditate, to focus the mind inward in order to find spiritual awareness or relaxation, nirvana, and a missionary. What is a missionary? So if you turn on page 120, it talks a little bit about Gautama deciding to start looking outwardly for the cause of suffering in the world and the environment around him. And he decided to start this process by meditating. Now we know from Hinduism, meditating is to focus the mind inwardly for a spiritual awareness or a spiritual reasoning or a spiritual connection of some sort. So Siddhartha Gautama starts the process of meditating and really feels like what he needs to do is find the cause of suffering through outward questions and outward observation. Meditation was an ancient Hindu practice, and Gautama actually went through that process. After talking with priests, he continued to search for the cause of suffering, and for about 30 to 40 years, he continued traveling the Indian countryside and trying to connect with people and find out exactly why it was they were suffering, and then put together some ideas on how maybe to alleviate, another good SAT word, that means relax or get rid of some of, ease some of that suffering. That's a better word, to ease some of that suffering. And many of his followers, they started going, ooh, this guy kind of knows stuff. Wow. We never really thought about suffering that way. We didn't think about it this way. And they started calling him the Buddha. Okay? Like I said, there are many different depictions, but this Buddha is happy, as you can see. And he's happy that I'm covering his religion, as I said before. But the word Buddha means enlightened one. In other words, a light went off, right? So if I've got, some of you said that this was a little dark in here, so if I do this, whoa, see that? And the enlightened one means the lights go on, and when that happens, things are realized or revealed, right? If your room is dark, the light, that was loud, the light goes on, and all of a sudden, you see things. And so the Buddha, which means enlightened one, was Siddhartha Gautama, and he kind of adopted that because he was enlightening or showing people what he felt was the ultimate cause or causes of suffering. So, on page 120, one of the things that he realized or he believed that caused suffering was ultimately, he believed that personal, complete, selfish, me-focused desires were the root of all suffering, ultimately. Because basically, in order to focus completely on you, you have to kind of squash everybody else, and you kind of have to do whatever you want to do, not thinking of anybody else. And when you're not thinking of anybody else, then other people get hurt. Be a buddy, not a bully. That's what he would think, or that's what he would say. All right? So Siddhartha Gautama, or the Buddha, believed that there were the cause of suffering was selfish, personal gain, personal desires that are kind of like off the charts, like way, oh, you can't even see it, way off the charts. All right? And because of that, he came up with 8, not 7, not 9, but 8. 8 ideas or pathways that he believed were important in order to alleviate, get rid of, or ultimately do away with this human suffering. On page 120, the practice of Buddhism, it's called the Eightfold or 8-Step Path. It's also called the Middle Way, and there's a reason it's called the Middle Way, which I'll talk about in just a second. But you can see on page 120 that on the left-hand side, there are basically 8 what he called rights, or 8 expectations, or 8 steps. The right to understanding, having faith in the Buddhist view of the universe. Number 2 is the right intention, making a commitment to Buddhism. Number 3 is the right speech, avoiding lies, mean, and abusive speech. Number 4, the right action, not taking a life, not stealing, and not hurting others in any form or fashion. Number 5, that was number 4, sorry. Number 5, did I do that? I can't remember. Anyway, number 5, the right livelihood, rejecting jobs and occupations that conflict with Buddhist ideas. That's an interesting one. We'll get to that. The right effort, avoiding bad attitudes. Bad attitudes. Don't have a bad attitude. And developing good ones, positive. And 7 and 8 are right mindfulness, being aware of your own feelings and thoughts, and then the right concentration, thinking deeply to find answer to problems, which I know by the time you guys get done with school, the last thing you want to do is think deeply about anything other than maybe Cheetos and iced tea and whatever mom's making in the kitchen, or dad's making in the kitchen, or grandma's making in the kitchen, or what I'm making in the kitchen, except I'm not making anything in the kitchen right now. Maybe a little bit later I'll bring out a Pop-Tart or something. But on page 120 is the middle way. Now, the middle way, according to Buddhism, Buddhism teaches people to follow the Eightfold Path, also known as the middle way. It's the same thing, just using different terms. And the reason it's called the Eightfold Path is because there are 8 steps. The reason it's called the middle way is because at the top, or I should say, on one side, we have extreme happiness. See that? And on the other side, we have extreme sadness. Everybody with me so far? With me? Good. All right. But in the middle way. So, what does that mean? Middle way. What it means is that Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, believed that selfish desires was the cause of all suffering. And in order for a person to avoid suffering, they had to avoid extreme happiness and extreme sadness. And if you look on page 120, it says, the second paragraph, the second sentence, by giving up selfish pleasures, a person can become free from suffering. That's ultimately what he believed. So in other words, if you look at the 8 different steps, the right understanding, having faith in the Buddha and the Buddhist view of the universe, and making a commitment to practicing Buddha and the Buddhist view of the universe. And if you have the right speech, that means no lying, avoiding swearing, abusive speech, and I know who you are. The right actions, in other words, you need to make sure that you're not hurting anybody through words, thoughts, or deeds. That means action. And making sure that you are respecting all of life. The right livelihood, in other words, once again, making sure that you're not in a position where you are hurting someone. So, for example, the possibility of being involved in the military where you might have to fight for your country and defend your life or the lives of others, the Buddhist idea and the military, because you might potentially have to hurt or kill someone in order to defend our country or defend yourself or defend your family or defend your friends, those ideas don't line up. So that, according to the traditional Buddhist teachings, would not take place. The right effort, avoiding bad attitudes and having good ones. We all struggle with that, especially on Monday mornings that are rainy and yucky. But, you can develop good attitudes and be more positive in your thought process. And then the last 2 is being aware of one's own feelings and thoughts, because if you're aware of how you feel, the Buddhist, or Buddhi, would say that if you're aware of how you feel, then you're not going to want to hurt anybody else. Okay? All right. So, on page 121, the next vocabulary word it talks about is nirvana. Now, Nirvana used to be a 1990s rock and roll band. They used to play a lot of grunge from the northwestern United States. I know it's kind of like a bad English accent, but, it's rock and roll, what can I say? On page 121, nirvana or lasting peace. Now, if you look on page 121, you see another picture of the Buddha, the statue there, and at the top it talks about Buddhism. People must act unselfishly towards others and treat people fairly. And when they do that, they must tell the truth at all times. And as they do that, suffering will lessen and lessen and lessen. In other words, it will get fewer situations of suffering. Eventually, when your suffering ends, you will find this nirvana, or this lasting peace that will exist supposedly forever and ever and ever. Now, the Buddhists believe in slight portions of reincarnation, so that when you hit nirvana, you ultimately break that cycle of reincarnation because you found that lasting peace, and it goes on and on for the rest of whatever your soul or existence may experience. All right? On page 121, it talks about followers of Buddhism. Buddhism also taught that everybody's equal, so there's no social classes. In other words, when the caste system, you will remember that we had a caste system in some ways. We had a triangle caste system in Egypt and in Hinduism. All right, so we had very similar ideas where the classes were divided up. One class was a higher class, one class was a lower class. But in Buddhism, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, teaches that all people are equal and that there is no actual social class. Because if I'm treating you fairly and equally, then you should be treating me fairly and equally. And that means that everybody is equal and that will lessen the suffering. Buddhism does have priests. If you look on page 121, chapter 4, section 3, the monastery is where the priests predominantly live, and they work on meditation, and they work on trying to educate other people how they can escape this suffering. Monasteries are where Buddhist monks, M-O-N-K, it's a fancy word for a Buddhist priest, a monk, M-O-N-K, and the monks live in these monasteries, and they are considered missionaries. And on page 121, you will see that a missionary is a person who spreads their religious beliefs to all parts of the world, okay? And there are Christian missionaries, there are Buddhist missionaries. All different types of religions have the concept of spreading their faith in the search of truth and happiness and eliminating suffering and obtaining nirvana, heaven, and basically a better afterlife at some point, okay? So that's the basics of where it got its founding, its ideas, what it does with that, and how the beliefs came about. On page 122, you will see that it talks briefly about Buddhism inside and outside of India. If you look at page 122, the spread of Buddhism is on the map up there, and you can see that it spread from India. There we go. All right, it's hard to see, I know. But you can see that it, get rid of my light a little bit here, spreads from India and goes all the way up through Asia and through China and ultimately out towards Japan. So a good portion of the Indian subcontinent, oh, I got an itch on my face, and the Indian subcontinent, and then into Asia, and then into Japan, and then of course from there it spread to other parts of the world. The last portion of section 3 of chapter 4 talks a little bit about Buddha's, after the Buddha's death, and how Hinduism and Buddhism kind of had some areas where they blended together and they kind of worked together. If you look on page 122, it says that Hinduism and Buddhism kind of existed side by side, predominantly because they believed in similar ideas of reincarnation. They believed that together that it is wrong to harm any living creatures. So whether it's a cockroach, whether it's you running for your life from a bear, whether, oh, by the way, if you're ever out with friends, this is a little side note, if you're ever out with friends, remember, if you're ever being chased by a bear, you don't have to outrun the bear. You only have to outrun your friend. Remember that. It's a good one. That way you don't hurt the bear, and you follow in line with Hinduism and Buddhist beliefs. So, all right? A little side note. Just tuck that away somewhere. You might see that again. It's a little hint for you, for those people who are watching. So, Hinduism and Buddhism kind of coexisted side by side. And if you look at both of them valued nonviolence and the idea of dharma and the cycle of rebirth, except for, of course, you can ultimately break that cycle of reincarnation. The Hindus came to honor Buddha as a reincarnation. In some parts of Hinduism, believe, the old school Hinduism, believe that the Buddha was a reincarnation of the god Vishnu. Okay, now not everyone necessarily believes that. That's not an automatic traditional kind of belief. There are some that do believe that. Every religion, of course, has its fine little parts that are slightly different. You will remember from Hinduism that Vishnu was considered the god of the preserver. And so some Hindus believe that the Buddha, and I think it says it here on page... on page 122, it says both value nonviolence, believe in Dharma, and the cycle of rebirth. Some Hindus came to honor Buddha as a reincarnation of the god Vishnu. So, Buddhists however, do not N-O-T, they do not embrace the Hindu texts. You remember the religious books, the Vedas, the Upanishads. They do not embrace those as necessarily legitimate or real kinds of guidelines. And most Hindus do not actually, on the flip side of that, most Hindus do not, I'm trying to think of the word, worship the Buddha as an avatar, specifically. Okay? So there's some similarities, some differences. You'll want to read through that on page 122. If you look on page 123, it talks about Buddhism accepted by millions of people in other lands. China, Buddhist monasteries began being built in China. From China, it spread to Korea and Japan. And today, it is very, very common to find the Buddhist culture and the Buddhist beliefs in Korea, China, Tibet, northern Nepal, certain parts of the Indian subcontinent, and just depending on where you actually travel. All right? Okay, so that takes care of most of what we need to do. Don't forget to go over your vocabulary, all of it, not just the root words, but all of the vocabulary. Remember to go over your Section 3 assessment questions, especially like down here. Does everybody see that? So make sure you go over those and the critical thinking parts of those. Critical thinking and comprehension. Make sure that you read through your notes, reread the textbook. There's only 3 sections, so it's not quite as long, but there is a written portion where you have to do some compare and contrast of a couple different aspects of the religions. So make sure you understand the basics of Hinduism, the basics of Buddhism, and how they are similar, how they are different. And of course, make sure that you understand the concept of the geography, basic geography of the Indian continent or subcontinent. And that should just about do it. I will be very, very happy to answer questions in class. However, one thing I noticed is a lot of you come in early on Friday morning or the day of the test and you bombard me with a ton of questions. You should be thinking about this ahead of time, right? So I want to make sure that you ask the questions ahead of time and not at the last minute. That's why I'm here in my kitchen. That's why we're here every day, or we're there every day at school. And you should be thinking ahead and trying to ask for questions or questions that you don't understand in advance. All right? That's about it. I hope you guys have a great week. Have a great evening. I'm not sure when you're going to watch this. If you're going to watch this, and that's fine too. But just remember, if you don't watch this, the Buddha will not be happy.